In Babylon, justice had a scent, myrrh, smoke, and blood. The same hands that built the Hanging Gardens also built the first code of law, carved into stone. But every law has a price. For every decree of purity, someone's body paid the debt. So who truly bore the cost of Babylon's glory? Chronicles record triumphs. The stones beneath them still whisper screams. If you value the historical record, subscribe, because when the tablets end, the flesh continues the story. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The Euphrates glided through the city like a vein of light, carrying not just water, but sanctity. On its banks rose temples to Ishtar and Shamash, their steps blackened by centuries of sacrifice. To the Babylonians, the law was not merely governance, it was cosmology. To sin against it was to tip the universe toward chaos. And so Babylon learned the cruelest equation in history, that purity required pain. Justice, they believed, could only exist if it was witnessed. And so they staged it. Every trial was theatre, every punishment a sermon. Citizens gathered in courtyards to watch transgressors punished in the name of divine equilibrium. The priests spoke of order. The crowd saw horror turned holy. This was the contradiction. At the empire's heart, a civilization that gave humanity its first written laws, its first astronomical maps, its first epic poem, yet defined obedience through spectacle. Babylon's brilliance did not shine despite cruelty. It was built upon it. It began with a proclamation carved in black basalt, a king standing before a god, one hand raised in devotion, the other receiving a staff of authority that shone like flame. This was Hammurabi, sixth king of Babylon, and the stone behind him would outlive every ziggurat, every dynasty, every god that blessed his throne. Upon that tablet of law, 7 feet tall and cold as eternity, he declared that justice itself was divine. In his vision, law was not invention, it was revelation. The Code of Hammurabi was introduced not as the product of men, but as the decree of Shamash, the god of justice. Every punishment, every clause, every hierarchy was sanctified by heaven's authority. By claiming the gods as legislators, Hammurabi achieved something more enduring than conquest: obedience without rebellion. Babylon at the time was an empire of astonishing complexity. Fields irrigated by canals, markets glittering with copper, and grain slaves from conquered cities, sold alongside incense and lapis lazuli. But order was fragile. Beneath the wealth seethed envy, lust, and the constant threat of chaos. Hammurabi understood that swords could command obedience only for a moment. Faith, however, could command it for generations. Thus, he crafted the first fully codified system of law, 282 rules carved into the basalt stela, now resting in the Louvre. Its language was surgical and absolute. If a builder constructs a house and it collapses, killing the owner, the builder shall be put to death. If a son strikes his father, his hands shall be cut off. The symmetry was brutal, the logic crystalline. Justice in Babylon was not blind, it was ornamental, displayed in balance carved in terror. The most striking line placed near the top of the tablet proclaimed Hammurabi's purpose: to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. Yet beneath that sentence lay a darker truth. The law did not protect equality, it preserved hierarchy. In Babylon, weak and strong were not moral categories, they were economic ones. The laws differentiated sharply between Awulu freemen, Mushkenu commoners, and Wardu slaves. The same act of blow, a theft, a death, was punished differently, depending on who performed it and upon whom. For the noble, a fine. For the commoner, a beating. For the slave, mutilation or death. The hierarchy was cosmic, not negotiable. Hammurabi's genius was not in inventing cruelty, but in systematizing it, making inequality seem sacred, an echo of divine order. By wrapping oppression in theology, he made rebellion a sin not just against the crown, but against the gods themselves. At the heart of this system stood an idea as seductive as it was terrifying, that morality could be measured, balanced, and priced. The law turned ethics into arithmetic. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Not mercy, not redemption, but transaction. A moral economy where injury was not forgiven but exchanged. A society where every wound had a price and every life a ledger. This was the birth of bureaucracy in blood. Scribes trained for years to memorize clauses. Priests recited them during rituals, and judges appointed by the king pronounced verdicts in the temple courtyards where incense mingled with dust. Justice was no longer an act of divine mystery. It was a profession, an office, a machine. The stela itself was more than a legal document, it was propaganda in stone. The top half, carved in relief, showed Hammurabi before Shamash, receiving symbols of power, the rod and ring. It was a masterpiece of divine marketing. Anyone who gazed upon the monument saw a perfect chain of authority: God, king, law, people. To question one link was to risk eternal damnation. And yet, there was genius in its cruelty. The code taught people not just to fear punishment, but to internalize surveillance. You did not need guards on every corner if the gods were said to watch every breath. You did not need to crush rebellion if every thought of defiance felt like blasphemy. Babylon's greatest invention was not writing or irrigation or architecture, it was the fusion of law and fear. Under Hammurabi's rule, that fear became a ritual. Before dawn, priests gathered in the great temple of Shamash. They poured libations of oil over tablets inscribed with oaths, chanting words that blurred law and prayer. May he who lies before the court perish in the river. The city awoke not to the sound of decrees, but of invocations. Law was not recited, it was worshipped. By sanctifying the code, Hammurabi built a civilization that appeared eternal. But in doing so, he also built a prison, invisible to the eye, the prison of moral obedience. The people no longer needed chains. They carried their fear within. Centuries later, empires would rise and fall upon the same principle. The Roman jurists, the medieval theologians, the modern bureaucrats, all heirs to Babylon's equation, that law is not a protection of the weak, but the performance of divine order. And so the stela endures. In the Louvre's pale light, you can still see Hammurabi's profile gazing upward toward his god, his lips parted as if whispering judgment. The surface gleams faintly, where fingers of countless pilgrims and conquerors have traced the words. The king is long dead, the god silent, but the idea remains. Justice carved in stone, fear written into faith. The empire of law began not with fairness, but with obedience. Obedience sanctified by terror. If Hammurabi built the architecture of order desire, was the fire threatening to burn it down? Babylon understood early what every empire learns too late, that no walls are high enough to contain the chaos of the human body. So the state learned to police not just actions, but passions. To control lust was to control lineage. To regulate pleasure was to regulate power. In the shadow of the ziggurat scribes recorded not wars or harvests, but the crimes of flesh. The clay tablets unearthed from Sipar Larsa and Ur reveal an astonishing obsession with sexual conduct, who slept with whom, under what circumstances, and with what social rank. The law did not separate the sacred from the sexual. It fused them. Desire was a religious matter because the body itself was a divine instrument. To misuse it was to offend the gods, and offending the gods threatened the city. Thus began the surveillance of intimacy. Marriage fidelity, even fertility, were absorbed into the logic of law. Women especially were transformed into public property, disguised as private devotion. A wife was not a partner, but a contract, an extension of her husband's estate. The legal tablets used the same verb for both to acquire. To marry was literally to take possession. The Code of Hammurabi devoted over 30 clauses to sexual morality. It forbade adultery, but not for reasons of faithfulness or virtue. Adultery was defined as the theft of another man's property, the woman's body as collateral, her honor as currency. A man who caught his wife with another could drown her if he wished. He could also pardon her, but only if the king approved. The law treated mercy as a royal privilege, not a human right. In contrast, if a husband committed adultery with a servant or prostitute, the tablets fell silent. The gods, it seemed, were not equally offended by male desire. What they feared was the confusion of inheritance, the possibility that power might flow through an illegitimate womb. Babylon's laws were less about purity than control of lineage. The body of a woman was an archive of ownership, and the law was its lock. Archaeologists once uncovered a letter from a merchant named Abum in 18th century BCE Mari. He writes to his wife, ordering her to stay indoors and avoid speaking to other men while he is away on business. His tone is not affection, but command. Beneath the words lies a quiet terror, the fear that a single act of desire could unravel the moral economy of an entire household. Every home was a miniature empire, and every wife its conquered territory. The law turned private life into performance. Marriage contracts were drawn up before witnesses sealed with clay impressions and stored in temple archives. Some even specified penalties for infertility or disobedience. One surviving contract declares, if she bears no child within 2 years, she may be sent away or replaced by a concubine. Love was not the foundation of union. Productivity was. Yet Babylon's control over desire was not confined to women. Men too were caught in the web, expected to embody discipline, virility, and paternal authority. A man who failed to produce heirs risked social suspicion. A man too indulgent in pleasure risked ruin. The law taught that pleasure without purpose was rebellion. Sexual energy belonged to the gods, to be used only in service of fertility or devotion. And so the temples became paradoxes, places of worship, where sex was both forbidden and required. Priestesses of Ishtar known as Naditu lived in ritual seclusion, dedicated to the goddess of Yet, bound by vows of celibacy. In contrast, temple courtesans performed sacred intercourse to bless fertility festivals. The line between holiness and sin blurred so completely that Babylon no longer distinguished between devotion and defilement. But this contradiction served power perfectly. When law and lust merged, morality became unchallengeable. The priests dictated who was pure and who was profane. The king's code transformed bodily autonomy into civic duty. The surveillance of desire did not rely on soldiers, it relied on shame. And shame, unlike chains, needed no iron. Imagine for a moment the daily life of a Babylonian woman, her footsteps measured, her voice moderated, her gaze lowered when passing a stranger. Every gesture calculated against suspicion. She carried not only her jewelry and veil, but also an invisible sentence, the presumption of guilt should she ever forget her role. The veil, often thought to be modesty's symbol, was actually the opposite, a legal boundary. Only noble women were permitted to wear it. Slaves and prostitutes were forbidden from covering their heads. Modesty itself became a privilege, another tool to divide women from one another. In public squares, these distinctions were obvious. The veiled wife passed untouched. The unveiled concubine endured glances that were not invitations, but reminders. She existed outside sanctity, outside law. For Babylon, morality was geometry. Every person had a fixed place, every desire a measured cost. Over time, this system created a civilization obsessed with appearances. A woman's body was her social document, a man's restraint his credential. Yet, beneath the surface lay corrosion, a moral exhaustion born of constant vigilance. For when love is regulated,